Imagine you are living quietly in the middle of nowhere, a small farm, a cold winter, a life measured in harvests and prayers. And a man arrives and tells you that if you pick up a weapon and walk east, God will forgive everything, every sin, every dark thing you have ever done. And not just forgiven, erased. Would you go? Tens of thousands of people did. Somewhere between 50 and 60,000 of them, by the best estimates historians can piece together. Farmers and knights and wandering preachers and second sons with nothing to inherit, gathered themselves up and started walking toward a city most of them had never seen, 3,000 miles away. They crossed rivers and mountains and deserts and hostile empires, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they arrived. And when they did, they carved a kingdom out of the heart of the medieval world. That is the story we are telling tonight. Before we go any further, if you are new here, consider subscribing. These are the kinds of stories we tell: slow, detailed, strange, true. And wherever in the world you are watching from right now, drop it in the comments. It is always remarkable to see how far these stories travel. Now, back to that field in southern France. It is November 1095. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd at the Council of Clermont, and he delivers a sermon that will alter the course of history, though no one present thought to write down his exact words. 5 different accounts survive, each slightly different, each reflecting what the writer believed or hoped had been said. Historians have argued over them ever since, but the effect of the speech is not in dispute. Urban called on the fighting men of Latin Christendom to take up arms, march to Jerusalem, and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. And to anyone who answered that call, he offered something that carried an almost incomprehensible weight in the medieval imagination: a plenary indulgence, complete remission of all sins. In a world where hell was not a metaphor, but a vivid, terrifying, entirely plausible destination, that promise landed like nothing else could. The crowd's response came back in a single phrase: Deus vult, God wills it. Why did the call spread so far, so fast? Part of it was the indulgence, that singular, extraordinary offer. Part of it was the deep and genuine devotion that ran through medieval life at every level, from throne rooms to dirt floors. Jerusalem was not just a city. It was the axis of the Christian world, the place where Christ had suffered and risen, and the idea that it sat under non-Christian rule was a wound that had been quietly festering for decades. Urban gave people a way to do something about it. But the appeal was not only spiritual. For the nobility, there was land to be won, glory to be seized, and a genuine sense that this was the defining adventure of the age. For younger sons who would inherit nothing at home, the Crusade offered a chance to carve out something of their own. The reasons multiplied and tangled together, and across the winter and spring of 1095 and 1096, the momentum became unstoppable. What actually assembled was 2 very different things. The first was what history calls the People's Crusade, a vast, passionate, largely unorganized movement stirred into motion by a preacher named Peter the Hermit. He was charismatic in the way that certain people simply are, magnetic, tireless, absolutely certain. Around 20,000 people followed him eastward in the spring of 1096, well before any formal military force was ready to move. They had conviction. What they lacked was almost everything else: adequate food, coherent leadership, military discipline, and any realistic plan for what would happen when they encountered a professional enemy army. By October 1096, the Seljuk Turks had effectively destroyed them at Sivito, in the hills of northwestern Anatolia. Peter survived. The movement he had built did not. It was a grim preview of what the road ahead would cost. The second force was something altogether different in character. Through the summer and early autumn of 1096, the great princes of Western Europe assembled their contingents and began moving east. What eventually converged on Constantinople in the spring of 1097 was a force that scholars today estimate at roughly 40 to 45,000 combatants, knights, infantry, crossbowmen, plus perhaps another 10 to 20,000 non-combatants, servants, clergy, women, pilgrims who had attached themselves to the march. Total participants somewhere in the range of 50 to 60,000, though those numbers remain genuinely uncertain. Medieval chroniclers counted the way people who wanted to impress their readers counted, and modern historians treat their figures with appropriate skepticism. What held such a diverse, fractious, multinational force together? Men who spoke different languages, served different lords, and harbored very different ideas about what they were marching toward, is one of the central mysteries of the whole enterprise. That is the question that carries us east. So they marched, from the Rhineland, from Lorraine, from Provence and southern Italy and the Norman kingdoms of the north. The great columns began their long convergence. The distance from Cologne to Jerusalem, following the routes these armies would have actually taken, through the Balkans and across Anatolia, runs to something in the neighborhood of 3,000 miles. That figure comes from modern pilgrimage estimates, and the medieval reality varied contingent by contingent, season by season. But 3,000 miles is a useful number to hold in your head. It is roughly the width of the continental United States. It is a year of walking, and it had to be done through lands that ranged from hostile to merely indifferent, with supply lines that barely existed and no guarantee of what waited at the other end. The first major test was Constantinople itself, or rather, the Byzantine emperor, who watched the Crusaders arrive at his doorstep with something between relief and barely suppressed alarm. Alexios I had asked for help. What he got was an enormous, heavily armed Western army camped outside his walls, eating his countryside and operating under leaders who made no secret of their ambitions. He moved quickly. He fed them, negotiated with them, extracted from the principal commanders sworn oaths that any formerly Byzantine's territory recovered in the campaign would be returned to the empire, and then, with great diplomatic haste, ferried them across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. For all its tension, the Byzantine relationship was not decorative. Imperial supply routes, naval support, and local intelligence would prove genuinely critical in the months ahead. Their first real objective was Nicaea, a walled city of considerable strategic importance sitting at the edge of the Anatolian plateau. The siege began in May of 1097 and didn't last long. Byzantine ships were dragged overland to cut off the city's lake supply routes, strangling Nicaea's defenses from a direction the garrison had not anticipated. By June, the city surrendered, directly to the Byzantines, as the terms required, before the Crusaders could claim it for themselves. It was a minor friction, and a revealing one. The alliance held. But it held the way ice holds, solid enough to walk on, colder underneath than you'd like to think. A month later came a different kind of lesson entirely. On July 1st, 1097, moving through the parched hills near Dorylaeum, the Crusader vanguard walked into a Seljuk ambush. The Turkish cavalry were everything Western knights were not in that terrain. Fast, fluid, expert at striking and retreating before a counterpunch could land. They swept around the columns and pressed hard, for hours in the summer heat. The Crusaders who bore the first impact had to hold, not advance, not break, just hold, until reinforcements could come up from further back in the line of march. They did. The relief arrived, and when the combined force turned and pressed the attack, the Turkish lines buckled. Dorylaeum was a victory, but the more important lesson was logistical, coordination between columns, and the discipline to maintain formation under the kind of mobile assault that these men had never trained to face. Beyond the battles, though, there was a slower, quieter catastrophe in progress. Anatolia in the high summer is unforgiving territory. Water sources were scarce and often contested. The land had been deliberately stripped of food and livestock by the retreating Turks, a scorched earth strategy as old as warfare itself. Men died not from arrows but from thirst, from the particular misery of dysentery spreading through a camp with no clean water and no sanitation, from fevers that had no names in the medicine of the time. Horses collapsed under their riders. Pack animals died by the hundreds, and when the horses were gone, knights who had trained their whole lives for mounted combat found themselves walking beside the infantry, carrying their own armor in the heat. There were desertions. There were men who simply lay down and did not rise again. By any honest accounting, the campaign's greatest enemy for most of its length was not the Seljuk cavalry. It was the road itself. And then there was Antioch. The siege of Antioch began in October 1097 and lasted until June 1098. 8 months that wore the army down to something unrecognizable. The city sat at a crossroads of empires, its walls among the most formidable in the medieval world. The Crusaders lacked the numbers to fully encircle it. A Muslim relief force arrived in the spring and engaged them in the field while the siege continued, fought on 2 fronts at once. Disease and starvation thinned the besieging army almost as fast as battle had. Men ate their horses. Desertion became a genuine crisis, and then, in the desperation of that siege, a contact emerged from inside the city. A garrison officer, his reasons his own, his grievances particular, agreed to open a gate in the dead of night. On June 3rd, 1098, the Crusaders poured through. Antioch fell. Almost immediately, an even larger Muslim relief army arrived from Mosul and Damascus. Now the Crusaders were the ones trapped inside the walls, starving, exhausted, convinced they would die there. It was during this siege within a siege that a peasant reportedly discovered something in the rubble. A spearhead, wrapped in cloth, claimed to be the Holy Lance, the very weapon that pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. Whether the lance was genuine hardly matters. The effect was, men who had been ready to surrender found something to fight for. They marched out of the city, outnumbered, desperate, and they broke the Muslim army in the field. Antioch was theirs, and Bohemond of Taranto, who had engineered the whole campaign, claimed it as his personal principality, Byzantine oaths notwithstanding. By the time the columns finally pushed south toward Jerusalem, the force that had started this march, somewhere in the range of 50 to 60,000 souls, had shrunk to perhaps 20,000 effective fighters. And that estimate is generous and uncertain. The chroniclers were not counting carefully by that point. Everyone who was left was simply trying to keep moving. That they arrived at all remains, by any measure, extraordinary. They arrived in June of 1099. Whatever they had imagined, and they had been imagining it for 3 years, through the mud of the Balkans and the killing heat of Anatolia and the long despair of Antioch, the city that appeared on the horizon was something that existed on a different plane from the practical world of sieges and supply routes. Jerusalem was not merely a strategic objective. It was, for many of these men, the axis around which everything holy and everything human rotated. They had walked 3,000 miles toward it. They had buried friends along every 100 of those miles. And now it was there, walled and quiet and real in the summer light. The siege began almost immediately. The city was held by a Fatimid garrison that had itself only recently taken it back from the Seljuks, and its defenders knew what was coming. The Crusaders were too few to surround the walls completely. They were short on timber, short on water. Springs and cisterns in the surrounding area had been contaminated or blocked by the defenders, and working in the full weight of a Palestinian July. What they had was the knowledge that there was nowhere left to march. This was the end of the road in every sense. Over the following weeks, timber was brought in from the coast with considerable effort and risk, and the Crusaders began constructing siege towers, great rolling wooden structures designed to bring men up level with the top of the walls. On the night of July 13th, 1099, the towers were moved into position. On July 14th, the assault began in earnest, and on the morning of July 15th, 1099, a knight named Letold became, according to the chroniclers, the first man to step from the siege tower onto the wall of Jerusalem. What followed is one of the most contested episodes in the history of the Crusades. The city was taken. There was violence, significant and awful, directed at the population inside. Jewish inhabitants who had taken refuge in a synagogue, Muslim civilians, portions of the garrison that did not escape in time. Medieval warfare rarely drew clean lines between combatants and non-combatants, and the sack of Jerusalem did not draw them at all. The chroniclers who recorded it, some in triumph, some in visible unease, left accounts that historians continue to weigh carefully, uncertain of exact numbers and scope. Certain, enough of the essential fact, that the capture was followed by killing on a scale that left a long shadow, and then, almost immediately, came the harder question. They had taken the city. Now what? They had perhaps 4 weeks to find out. The Fatimid army from Egypt, delayed by their own politics and logistics, arrived in August and engaged the Crusaders near Ascalon, south of Jerusalem. The battle was brief. The Fatimid force broke. The road to Jerusalem was secured, not by walls or treaties, but by a single afternoon in the field. The kingdom was real. The county of Edessa had been established back in 1098, when Baldwin of Bologna, Godfrey's younger brother, had moved east and, through a combination of military force and local political maneuvering, secured control of a territory beyond the Euphrates. The Principality of Antioch had crystallized around Bohemond of Taranto, who had stayed behind after the siege, never quite intending to march all the way to Jerusalem, fully intending to rule what he had already won. These were not improvised afterthoughts. They were the first shapes of something permanent. Latin political structures taking root in soil that was Byzantine, Seljuk, Armenian, and Arab all at once. The kingdom of Jerusalem followed. Godfrey of Bouillon, who had led his men over the wall, was offered its crown and, in what was either genuine piety or careful political theatre, declined to call himself king of the city, where Christ had been crowned with thorns. He took the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre instead. Defender of the Holy Tomb, not ruler of a kingdom. He died the following year before anyone fully understood what he had built. His brother Baldwin had no such scruple. He crossed from Edessa to Jerusalem in 1100, accepted the crown, and was crowned Baldwin I, King of Jerusalem, in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. What he inherited was a strip of coastline, a handful of inland cities, and a border with almost everyone. The kingdom was small, poor by European standards, and surrounded by powers that wanted it gone. What it had was position, and the sea lanes back to Europe, which meant reinforcements, trade, and the steady pulse of new arrivals from the west who had heard the call. The men and women who stayed, and many did stay, putting down roots in a land most of them had never seen before, became something new. They learned the politics of a fractured region. They adopted local building techniques, local dress in some cases, local medical knowledge. They intermarried occasionally with Eastern Christian families. They built castles that blended Norman and Byzantine forms. They became, over time, a feudal aristocracy that was neither quite European nor quite anything else. A Latin culture grafted onto an ancient landscape, dependent on the sea lanes back to Europe and on a steady trickle of new arrivals from the West to replenish what disease and warfare continually took. Why did it succeed? There is no single clean answer that historians agree on. Religious conviction mattered, clearly. You do not march 3,000 miles on empty faith. So did the particular fragmentation of the Muslim world at that moment, divided between Fatimid and Seljuk power, in ways that prevented a coordinated response. So did Byzantine logistical support and the hard competence of specific leaders at specific moments, and a series of fortunes that might easily have gone the other way. The 4 Crusader states they left behind would endure, in varying forms, for nearly 2 centuries. A narrow strip of Latin territory, running along the eastern Mediterranean coast, improbable, expensive, and fiercely defended, outlasting every reasonable prediction of its survival. What they built there, fragile, impossible, wrapped in faith and fire, would outlast every king who raised it and every sultan who tried to tear it down. For nearly 200 years.